Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm glad for you to join us tonight. I'm Bob Weathers here at Your Vitality Project, and we're here for our Friday night conversation with our dear, esteemed, and returning guest, Angela McLeod.
Hi.
Nice to have
Good to
you.
be here.
Nice to have you here. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Angela and I met earlier today, and we're talking about some of the ways that we can label ourselves unkindly and unhelpfully. And tonight's topic is about how we can place expectations on ourselves in relationships that, while there's nothing wrong with having expectations of ourselves, sometimes those expectations turn into very unforgiving requirements that, just as with labeling ourselves, can really stymie us, not only inside our own experience, but also within relationships. So just broadly defined, we want to talk about this tonight. So we're talking about expectations or requirements or labels and what we can do to find a little bit more generosity for ourselves, and look at how that can impact relationships, particularly how that can impact relationships favorably. There are posts in the last several days that are looking at this focus of the current module here on relationships. And so I encourage you, if you haven't been following those, to go back and read those, which will provide more of a context for what we're talking about tonight, which is looking at how can we apply helpful skills from mind-body bridging, which is the model that we've been operating from. How can we apply those now to relationships? So that's what we're looking at these days. So Angela, I'm happy for you to be here, and I'd love to invite any reflections that you have on any of this, and we can just dialogue for a few minutes.
Okay. Yeah. I used your directions in the post today, and just followed it out, and I had like this chart laying out in front of me after I, did each of the steps, and I just noticed right off by doing that, and by identifying a relationship that's important to me, and then by asking myself first, how should I be in this relationship, and just writing those down and kind of just letting myself, what first comes up, not being really analyzing it. And then the next one is to then write the opposite, kind of the opposite of each of those. And I did that, and then to kind of go back and see put a connection line between them, and in a way that they became like these polar opposites, is what I noticed. But then the direction was to feel how does each of them feel. And so then that brought in, listening inside of myself. And I realized that took a while, to kind of really pause and spend time with each of those shoulds or expectations. And I realized also in this step, it really had me focus on myself. What are my expectations of myself in the relationship? And so I'll be curious to see how this unfolds, because when I saw the title, expectations in relationship, that made me think of, what do I expect from the relationship or the other person? But the actual steps were all focused on what's going on right here. And I like that focus.
Just for you to know, Angela, and you know me enough to know, probably expect this. That's coming.
I thought that would be.
This is really kind of meant the first phase, and I realize it's kind of surprising.
Yeah.
Well, in relationship, what are my expectations of myself? And soon enough, we'll be looking at the expectations or even requirements that we put on our friends and other significant others. So that's coming. But thank you for keep going. Yeah, I'm interested in your experience.
So for me, where that left me, it's like, as I was feeling into it, there was sort of this question mark. Okay, well, now what do I do with this? So that was kind of the end of the exercise. But I realized that I had different feelings were coming up, and when this really actually has a lot of parallels with the Kiloby inquiry process that I'm really engaged in. Because my sense of noticing a should or a thought about, of how I should be in a relationship, and then reversing it. So you said make the opposite, but we do that in the Kiloby inquiries. We do a reverse inquiry, not to try to get me to think or feel differently. It's not aimed at that. It's aimed at kind of mining down into the subconscious to see where we have sticky emotional stuff tied up, and so that's why then that at the end of the exercise, my feeling was, well, now what do I do with all of this? Because so what I did with it was I just took some breaths, and I was already in resting brain mode. I felt pretty calm and centered, and I realized that just the act of just gently going through and writing these things down allowed me to kind of put it outside of myself and look at it a little bit more objectively. So even though there were some things that it was like, ew, I don't like that about myself, or that's not good enough. So I was seeing those self-judgments and pain about something that's unfulfilling. But instead of it feeling like I was all stuck in it, I was like seeing it more objectively and just allowing it to be. And then likewise with the emotions, I let myself slow down and notice how my body felt. Because for me, emotions, I can say I'm sad and it's a word, it's like a concept, but it's often really a whole being experience. So being in the body feeling of that, those energies seemed like an important thing. So that's where I went with the exercise today.
I appreciate so much you're diving in, and I'd like to respond to just a couple of things you've mentioned. Because of the complexity of this process, because now we've introduced relationships and it kind of exponentially complicates things. This exercise that you did it beautifully, and I really appreciate you laying it out so that even listeners who haven't read it can actually kind of begin to visualize, at least as a beginning, what it is that we're inviting people to engage with. Is that this really does kind of just stop right there. It's not at all completed. It's just like, this is the first pass. The next one I can tell you is to go back and look at those where we feel the ickiness, because we won't feel the ickiness with all of those, but it's to ask, if you go around the outside of the circle, I'll pick one because I know it would be an icky one for me, is that if my desire is to be industrious or productive, which it is, that's a conscious desire, then the flip side of that might be to be lazy or unproductive. And if I come to that on the outside, that would be one that would have some loading for me in terms of the ickiness factor. And what I'm doing, where we're going with this in the next post or two, is beginning to look at those icky experiences as triggers, and that little line that you drew between the less desired quality, I'll use my example of laziness, to draw that line to contributing or productive or active or whatever its opposite would be, is you begin to realize that trigger is oftentimes linked to a requirement that Bob must be productive. And so it's to make more conscious the connection between these triggers and requirements. And even that doesn't complete the exercise, but you did today because you're so tuned into this, is that it's to look at that. And I asked to feel into that. And in this state of mind and body, then what might you be inclined to do or say? How much you respond? Let's say in a relationship, when maybe somebody insinuates that you're lazy, and I'll use just my example. Well, you can see that can be inciting or activating, and so I wanted individuals over these next series of exercises to look at the implications of these triggers and requirements in terms of how they lead to certain action patterns and so on. But it doesn't stop there. It actually ends up where you went, Angela, which is, what would it be like to go back and look at this, in fact, generate another map just like this one, but do it after having centered ourselves, like you were talking about being in resting brain. And so whether it's dancing, as it might be for you, or we've been using mindfulness of the breath as an exercise, or drumming for me, whatever it might be, what would it be like to go back into that same map, create the same circles, what are some desired qualities, what are some undesired qualities, and just the only intervening variable would be to introduce resting brain. How does that affect? And it's a curiosity, because there's no guarantee how this will work out, but how does that affect, for example, what we're calling the ickiness factor? And my sense of it, having practiced with this since I'm writing this material right now, is that it doesn't make it go away, but it does modify it. It does begin to temper the ickiness. And that seems of value to me. And so that's a little bit of where we're going. And that's just the start of introducing some way of relaxing our bodies and minds, even as we face these icky triggers, and then looking at how does this affect us in relationships? Because honestly, many of the pitfalls, as you know, and I know, because we've both been in long-term relationships, can be around these kinds of things where it's just like, there's something that's said. Sometimes there's bickering that goes on, or there's certain kind of like hot spots that we have, and somebody touches on those, and the next thing you know that you're either aggravated or withdrawing or whatever. So we're trying to open up what we're talking about in the context of relationships, and the centrality of this in terms of relationships is their relevance to addiction recovery. And that would be today's post, where I cited Johann Hari, who says the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. And so we're looking at what are the things that facilitate our staying connected? What are the things that lead us to disconnect? And can we address those more consciously?
Yeah, well, I know certainly for me that a huge, if not primary driver for addiction for me is, lack of connection.
Yes.
And it's been some other parts of it too, but like I really appreciate what you're saying, and I really love that that video that Johann Hari did, because it just seemed so right on, and I just hope everybody watches that one.
Yeah. Angela, I want to say this in support of you, but all of us, and I'm in the same boat. I think there's so much value in addiction recovery treatment centers and in self-help support groups like the 12-step support groups as an example, where there's a great deal of focus on individual responsibility. In essence, whatever the language is, I've got to kind of pull myself up by my own bootstraps. I got myself into this fix, and I need to recover. I need to embrace sobriety. I think there's tremendous value in it. But I think the piece that oftentimes gets missed, at least in my experience, is what you just said, and I relate to this not only professionally, but also deeply personally, is that loneliness or disconnection or ruptures in relationship or chronic friction, just go down the list of things relationally, those were primary in my own addiction. I know it now. In hindsight, I knew it when it was going on. You and I talked about this. I can remember times that I would drink or drug to try to move myself out of what it felt like to feel so doggone lonely or so in conflict, owing to relationship. And this only has been confirmed in all these years now of meeting with hundreds of people in groups and asking questions around what it is that's contributed, in their view, to their addictive behaviors. And while it's not making an excuse, it's acknowledging that we are social beings. And Johann Hari is right, is that my addiction in many ways was owing to disconnection. I couldn't figure out how to make a difference in that. And connection has made all the difference, including our connection has made all the difference in recovery. And so I really want to underscore what you're saying, which is our relationships really, really matter when we're talking about recovery.
Totally agree with you there. Yeah. And so I can see why this mind-body mapping in this section on relationships is so valuable to start to unpack, how it is to relate, in a healthy way. I want to do one of these little maps with my relationship to myself. I almost did that, and then I thought, no, I think I'll do this exercise with this person in my life. You know, you suggested picking an important relationship, so I did that, and I think
I
maybe
like that.
I think why it might be valuable for me is just because we do have our own, we talk to ourselves. You know, we have
Yeah.
these voices or we have these attitudes
Mhm.
that can either help or really hinder
Yes.
our
Yeah.
lives, and
Yeah.
that might connect a little bit in with what I was sharing with you earlier today about being in a I will say a dip of depression, but I've been sort of shifting from using that term because I've had chronic ongoing depression through most of my life. But as I've really examined what is actually happening for me in depression, I'm moving more into seeing it as I have these biorhythms, these rhythms
Yeah.
where I have more energy, I'm more out there, I'm more a little upbeat or inspired, and then I have these other rhythms where I'm more tired, and there's like a combination of things. It's more helpful to me to look at it as a biorhythm with a combination of elements rather than to turn it into like this illness or a pathology called
Yeah.
depression, because it doesn't help me very much to just say I'm depressed, you know. So I've been working with that in the last few days and identifying. Well, what's been wonderful is that because this is a repeating pattern for me in my life, it sometimes sneaks up on me. You know, the rhythm. It's like, oh, what am I noticing? Here it is again. I'm I'm hearing a lot of negative talk in my head. You know, I feel overwhelmed. So I have my own particular list of
Yeah.
things that kind of clump together. Um, I'm physically more tired, and there's a few other elements, but those are some of the big ones. And also I feel bleak about the future. You know, there's like worries about the future, so I get into this worry mode. And so what I noticed in the last day or so, that there's been this shift for me in instead of spiraling down further, because if I listen to those voices and that tone of, you know, things are pretty bleak, then it just seems to go further down for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what I've been learning how to do a little bit more is, first of all, to not hold it as a problem, but to say, okay, this is a part of me. What does this part of me need? You know, this is a
Yeah.
part of my experience. How can I respond to this? How can I dance with this part of me that's tired? And so almost starting to have a dialogue with the negative thinking, like, well, gee, negative thinker, what do you need? Okay, sometimes I write it all out. I just write it. And then I set it aside. And then I'll go do some qigong or I'll go on a walk. Often I need to just expect less of myself, because when I'm in the upside, I'm very productive and I get lots of things done. But when I'm in the downswing, I don't have as much energy. I can't focus as well. But I think I should be doing that. I
Yeah.
feel like I should. And so that's a little bit of how I'm looking right now at relating to myself and reframing this
Yeah.
part of my experience so that it's actually a more positive experience, and then that I can actually tend it or myself in
Yeah.
a way that is more life-giving.
Yeah, it's so beautiful to me. What you shared this morning, and then you're expanding on it tonight. I really hope that there are those that will view this dialogue between us and really take to heart what you're suggesting. I feel like it's so incredibly important in our lives in terms of just general well-being, much less specifically as applied to recovery from addiction. There are so many shaming messages that we internalize in addiction, and then in early recovery, we're stuck with those memories because they're fresh, and then we're also introduced to the fact that now we're in recovery. There's judgment about that because
Yeah.
that means we were addicted. So there's just so many problems around recovery in this regard. And if we can find ways of delabeling ourselves, or just removing labels that don't serve, and finding more compassionate ways. I love how you talk about biorhythms as opposed your own biorhythms, as opposed to looking at this in terms of diagnostic categories like depression or anxiety or whatever like that. And I want to come back to something that you started with, which was looking at applying this exercise today to different parts of yourself. I really appreciate, I love your creativity and I appreciate that very much. I wanted to share with you, you know this, but I just met with a client this afternoon who was wanting me to walk her through forgiveness practice. And I did it. I walked her through it. It was brief because it was just a part of an hour on the phone. But one of the things I said at the end is I shared with her, as you know, Angela, that as this has evolved for me over the years, I work at forgiving different parts of myself in this kind of dialogue. You and I've talked about it in terms of active imagination. And I feel like it's very much the same spirit is that to look at expectations that we'd place on ourselves or that we'd place on others, expectations that we'd place on parts of ourselves, however one wants to apply this to be able to be creative with this and bring in grace and self-compassion. I'm all for that. I'm all for that. It made me think, Angela, that at some point down the line, I'd like to do, and this might be something that you and I could do together, I'd like to do a presentation or a series on self-compassion, utilizing the forgiveness practice that we've published here at Your Vitality Project, but using it as an interior practice on the different parts of ourselves. I'd love to do that. I know that you and I have done this in our own conversations, and you have your own languaging of that, and I mine. But I love this idea of finding grace for parts of ourselves rather than polarizing and splitting ourselves into bits and labeling some bits as good and some bits as bad. I just feel like, is there a way that we can be all of these selves with grace? Yeah.
And I loved what you said earlier today, the alchemical solutio. And the difference between the word solution, like how we normally use this, I need to find a solution. Between that, this has been really percolating for me all day today, because doing the map that I did, the body-mind mapping,
yes.
I realized that where I would normally go if I were to say, oh, I'm being too needy, in relation to this friend, then I would then jump into my mind, I need to fix this. I need to find a solution. I shouldn't be this way.
Yeah.
But in the body-mind mapping process, just the way that you go through these steps and you lay it out there, to me, it's like bringing in that more of that image of water or the grace or the solution, putting all of it into solution without trying to fix it. So I'm not trying to deny it or repress it or say it should be different, but I'm also not getting stuck in it and thinking, like I can go downhill. And so I've been really, really appreciating that imagery, the water imagery, the dissolving. And the thing is I feel like that watery image, it's like you're bringing the compassion in. And in between all of these, the different voices, the different shoulds, some of mine were positive too, by the way. Some of them like, oh, that's really good. I'm speaking my truth, in this relationship situation where I thought that if I say something, then it's going to hurt their feelings, but I did it anyway. And then the counter should was, I shouldn't do that. But then on the outside of the ring, I realized, well, that's really good. I was able to stand up for myself and speak my truth. So, but anyway, back to that image of compassion as the solution, as the saluting, dissolving element. So thank you for sharing that with me again.
Yeah, I love very much you're working with those watery images of solutio, of solution. And it's a different way of thinking of, I hate to even use the word because it's used in such a specific way. It's a different way of thinking of solving something. If we think of almost in the spirit of dissolving by letting it move into the solution. One of my favorite poems, you shared with me earlier, the book you have of Rumi's, and one of my favorite poems in that book is a brief poem, and he writes as a Middle Easterner, but he writes using in the language of Christian faith. And it would require somebody to be a Christian to find value in this, but I just want to preface it by saying he puts it in Christian language. He says, Christ is the population of the world and every object as well. Think of what we've just been talking about, everything. And every object as well. There's no room for hypocrisy. And by hypocrisy, he means splitting things up against each other. Well, I'm better than you. That's what he means. There's no room for hypocrisy. The last line of this very short poem, I just love it. He says, why use bitter soup for healing when sweet water is everywhere? I just love that sentiment. And I think what we're talking about is a sweetness. It's a graciousness. Water is the water of compassion. In every religious tradition, every spiritual path uses images of water this way. Well, why don't we utilize that here? And I think we are. That's very much the spirit of this.
Yes, thank you. That was lovely.
It's beautiful, isn't it? Yeah, it's beautiful. We're going to wind down just because of the end of the day, but I want to give the final word to you as always, Angela. Any final thoughts or reflections as we wind down? There's so much more, and we'll be coming back more for sure with topics like this. But I'd love to invite you to conclude tonight if there's anything.
I just think the last thing you just shared just feels like such a nice ending. You know, really, I don't have nothing else is coming to say, but just thank you. And I love doing this with you. And
me too. Yeah. Here's the sweet water. Okay.
All right.
I wish you a beautiful evening and weekend, Angela. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all. And for all that were here tonight, thank you for being with us. Somebody wrote as we were speaking, and I invite them to write me or contact me at the email address. It's at Vitality Project. If you write me, I'll get back to you as soon as I'm able. Okay. So thank you again, Angela. Blessings to you. Much love to everybody. We'll see you all again. We'll be back next Friday, you all. So be sure to be back with Angela and me. All right. Good evening. Bye-bye for now.